Hello, welcome to the lecture. I'm Cynthia McCallister. In this lecture, you'll learn about the responsibility team format, including its primary aim and procedures. This lecture also includes a full description of the responsibility team format. Responsibility teams provide an opportunity for a small group of diversely abled students to cooperatively work together in groups. Students follow procedures that enable each group member to successfully complete a task that resembles a high-stakes challenge and that each student will independently face in the future. Responsibility teams embody what is known as prolepsis, or the act of accomplishing or doing something in the present in anticipation of encountering that thing in the future. Proleptic learning opportunities help students anticipate future challenges in order to prepare, gain skill, and confidence. The term prolepsis originates from the Greek word that means to take beforehand. It's an act of anticipation in which a future act or stage of development is accomplished or confronted in the present. The primary aim of responsibility teams is to support students in gaining access to knowledge, developing normative skills, competencies, and understandings in relation to target learning standards or curriculum goals, to gain insight into personal, social, emotional dispositions and develop them in the context of group support, to utilize processes of perspective shifting and cooperative reasoning to interpret texts, to develop dispositions of interdependence to cooperatively achieve group goals. Summary procedures are as follows. Responsibility teams are selected through a draft whereby teacher-appointed captains select team members in turn from a class roster. Teams work together through a predetermined cycle, such as a semester or a unit or a month. Prior to the work cycle, students take content and social pre-assessments. Copies of these types of assessments are available in the resource section of this lecture. The teacher determines the mean team scores on the content assessment and posts them. Social pre-assessment scores are provided to individual students. Teachers then distribute either a pretest or a content outline to all teams. The content outline can be a list of test questions, concepts that are the focus of the unit, curriculum scope and sequence concepts turned into questions, or end-of-unit questions. In their teams, students follow this process. Each student completes a social survey, also known as CDEEP, on each member of their group. Group leaders collect the surveys and distribute them to group members. Group members then calculate the mean score for each category on the CDEEP form and record it. Each group member then calculates the mean score for each category on the CDEEP social assessment record. Read content questions in unison provided by the teacher in single order in order to analyze them for target concepts. Step 2. Identify target competencies, concepts, or understandings that the question depends upon to be accurately answered. So you need to note, the object of step 1 and 2 is strictly limited to trying to understand what concepts need to be learned in order to accurately answer the question. The object is not to answer the question at this point. Step 3. Delegate responsibility to individual team members to research and report back summaries of required information or knowledge that needs to be learned in order to answer the question. Step 4. Reread the questions in unison in order to answer them. Finally, in step 4, students have an opportunity to answer the questions. Step 5. Take content and social post-assessments. Teachers announce which groups made the most progress from pre to post-assessment on the content assessments. Growth for social assessment should only be given to individual students and not be made public. However, teachers could calculate mean gains for groups and post those. Individual students then review their growth between social, pre, and post-assessments. The materials you'll need are a class list, a set of die, they can be physical or electronic, a social assessment, a pre- and post-test, a curriculum scope and sequence or sample tests or end-of-lecture questions, a GIST inventory form, also known as the matrix, a study guide, and an inquiry plan. These forms and resources can be found in the resources section of this lecture. The responsibility team system approaches content subject learning from a game-like stance. While students work in interdependent responsibility teams to compete to make the greatest collective progress in learning through a rigorous process of teamwork and collaboration, students prepare for a future challenge, such as a high-stakes test or an end-of-unit assessment. To get things started, the teacher develops 2 mock tests to be given at the beginning and end of the unit. Mock tests can be created from assessment questions from previous year's state tests, end-of-lecture questions, or formal curriculum statements revised as test questions. The object of the responsibility team game is for each team to improve its mean average. Students take the mock tests, and their team's mean score is reported publicly. At the end of the game, the team to have made the highest gains wins the tournament. The work that students complete during the tournament cycle is focused around collectively analyzing, learning about, and answering questions provided by the teacher. The questions can take one of several forms. The pretest given at the start of the cycle can serve as the content questions. An additional mock test to the pre and post can be created by the teacher, including content from the unit covered during the tournament. A curriculum scope and sequence document can be used, and curriculum statements can be reworded into questions, or end-of-chapter questions or unit questions from a textbook can be used. The ground rules are as follows. Working together as a group, team members make sure that every person fully understands every question or piece of information that comes before the group. In other words, each team member needs to support their teammates in mastering every question pertaining to material covered. Each group member has responsibility to ensure that fellow group members can fully understand all questions and accurately answer them. Here are some important procedures to adhere to. Teachers should create a Learning Targets handout that essentially outlines the tournament agenda. This handout can include relevant standards or curriculum scope and sequence content. This is helpful because when students analyze questions that probe knowledge well beyond their grasp, a frame of reference of concepts or skills helps to guide their inquiry. Some teachers, such as upper elementary or middle school teachers, prefer to narrow down content of learning targets in order to include only concepts that will be covered in a given unit. Other teachers prefer to present students with the comprehensive course curriculum and allow students themselves to determine how they will narrow their focus in order to systematically work through all of the content. Teachers create a set of content questions. These questions will serve as the group's working agenda for the tournament. The questions can be drawn from archived state assessments or textbook unit tests. These are the questions that students will analyze, study for, and answer. In unison, students read and analyze each item for its target, skill, or concept. At this point, students analyze only for content and don't make an attempt to answer the question. Using the GIST inventory or matrix inventory, students identify the question or statement in the upper heading of the column, and then, after discussion, in the row heading on the left, write a brief summary or gist of the learning target that's probed in the question. Again, students don't answer the question, they analyze for the concepts the question probes. When in doubt about the content reference, after sufficient deliberation, students can refer to the Learning Targets handout that the teacher distributes. These target handouts will provide language to help students identify the concept or skill in question. Once they've analyzed the question for the content, aligning the question to the concept. For example, question 3 on the New York State History Regents exam of 2003 was, the main criticism of the Articles of Confederation was that they failed to 1. Allow for the admission of new states, 2. Limit the powers of the President, 3. Provide adequate powers for the central government, or 4. Prevent the development of military rule. Now, the group will be tempted to answer the question. What the group needs to do at this point, though, is to try to figure out what needs to be studied for. In this case, it would be the criticisms of the Articles of Confederation. Students review the completed inventory form once they've finished all the questions or once they've done a certain set of them that they've decided ahead of time in order to create a study guide. They create a study guide by flipping each of the summary statement into focus questions. So, for example, the criticisms of the Articles of Confederation would be turned into a study guide question. What were the criticisms of the Articles of Confederation? The teams then delegate responsibility to each team member to research and answer questions from the study guide. Teams can either distribute responsibility evenly or decide that each member will plan to answer all questions. Students should write summaries of the content they were assigned in a comprehensible narrative format so that new knowledge can easily be accessible to all members. For example, the student who was assigned the Articles of Confederation criticism question would need to respond to the group in writing, offering an answer to the question. Teams plan how to use work time appropriately. Students should reference the calendar to develop a systematic plan to cover all content on the study guide before the end of the unit. The group should plan a strategy for successful learning. Teachers need to teach into responsibilities and social processes related to the responsibility team cycle. Students need to take responsibility to manage their groups. Invariably, there are group members who try to camouflage themselves at the responsibility team table as productive members, but in reality sit idly and avoid engaging in work. In these cases, the team members must take responsibility to either hold the student responsible for contributing or giving the student a warning and then asking them to leave the group. Inaction on the part of the group is a violation of Responsibility Team Rubric Indicator 1A, being attentive to group members, and 1F, collectively delegating work to all members. If the group fails to take this responsibility seriously, the teacher should use the steps in the ladder of regulation to address this problem. For example, first a warning, or then having all students move their seats as they disband the group, or whatever consequences apply. Strategies for work time can include but not be limited to the following. Groups can utilize the Learning Cultures formats to advance their understanding of target concepts. For example, test items or content resources can be used in cooperative unison reading or learning conferences. Groups can submit lesson requests to the teacher. Groups can communicate by email and meet outside of class to study or learn content, and groups can work with other groups to study and learn content. The group should attempt to complete at least one set of content questions in order to have sufficient opportunity to allow each person to succeed in the post-assessment. The team should develop an accountability system to ensure that all members of the group understand pertinent information. Note, the group needs to be considerate of non-English speakers' needs to access content in their first or native language if necessary. Here's a note to teachers. On grouping, organize a system for students to organize themselves into groups of 5 or fewer. Here are some suggested grouping strategies. Appoint a pair of strong leaders as group captains for each group in your initial tournament. Pair someone who tends to be a strong positive leader with someone who tends to be a strong negative leader. Make sure you continually revise a strategy for selecting group leaders. All students should have the opportunity to eventually become a group leader in responsibility teams, and it's probably a good idea to meet with grade or content teams to make sure that these responsibilities are continually distributed so that the same students aren't always responsibility team leaders. Meet with team captains to help them choose teams of 5 or fewer students. Have the captains toss a dice or flip a coin to determine the selection order. Then have captains choose team members, taking turns. For classes that aren't linked to a state exam, you can organize pre- and post-tests around units or curriculum scope and sequence sections. Responsibility teams harness some of the magical power of collective goals and intentions. Achievement metrics are formulated so that every group member's efforts are needed to buoy the group's accomplishments. Because accountability to the group is distributed to all members, the source of motivation for participation and engagement for all students rests on their respective obligations to the group, rather than intrinsic motivation to learn or achieve as an individual. This is particularly significant for students who would otherwise tend to be avoidant, resistant, or disengaged. Their reputation as a group member and duties to the group operate on new motivational states. Responsibility teams are also strategically designed to incorporate a process of group deliberation and cooperative reasoning. Students systematically analyze curriculum standards or questions, not to determine the correct answer, but to determine what knowledge, understandings, or skills the group needs to gather in order to have sufficient expertise to answer the question. This altered focus, away from effort at getting the right answer to a focus on the processes and procedures needed in order to get the right answer, helps foster all of the executive functions discussed earlier. Students use the GIST inventory form or the matrix form to document their deliberations. Once they've delineated a list of discrete understandings or skills that need to be collected, the group delegates responsibility to each group member to collect needed knowledge. Again, the obligation to the group, as opposed to intrinsic motivation for the topic at hand, is the psychological process that's targeted in this process. Each group member is responsible to then go on a scavenger hunt for information that's required. They're expected to document and collect evidence of their inquiry and then report back to the group in a format that's comprehensible. That is, chicken scratch notes or piles of printed Google searches are not acceptable. Each student must put their contributions into a text or audio form that's comprehensible and useful to all members. The responsibility team procedure involves pre- and post-tests of academic or content achievement and social-emotional assessments. The former is an indicator of how much a student has learned about the content at hand. The latter is an indication of how they've grown as a social participant. Social emotional dispositions of responsibility, generosity, consideration, empathy, compassion, among others, is the oil that greases the cognitive machinery of the individual and group learning process within the responsibility team format. Responsibility teams also cast learning and cooperative activity into a game-like forum. This enables each student to invest the spirit of joy and enthusiasm into schoolwork that they are accustomed to investing in play and other intrinsically enjoyable and amusing pastimes. Responsibility teams are the spoonful of sugar.